the northern Great Plains in February. Air temperature, -35°C. Wind howling across treeless expanse at 20 miles per hour, driving the cold through anything in its path. Wind chill, -50°C. Snow has covered the ground for 4 months. It will not melt for another 2. A modern winter camper, equipped with a synthetic sleeping bag rated to -40°C, a 4-season tent, a propane stove, would last perhaps 6 hours in these conditions before cold began winning. 8 hours, and hypothermia becomes likely. 12 hours, and survival becomes uncertain. Now consider this. Entire communities lived here. Not survived, lived, in structures made of buffalo hide stretched over wooden poles, heated by fires you could cover with both hands, for 5 continuous months. And European fur traders who visited these homes in the 1830s didn't write about endurance or suffering. They wrote about removing their coats because the interiors were uncomfortably warm. This wasn't primitive survival. This was engineering that worked when everything in the environment said it shouldn't. Chapter 1. Winter on the Northern Plains, the region stretching across modern Montana, the Dakotas, and up into the Canadian prairies, operates at a scale that defies casual understanding. Temperatures between -20°C and -40°C persist not for days, but for months. October brings snow. April finally releases it. Between these points lies half a year of cold, so penetrating that exposed skin freezes in minutes. The wind never stops. 10 to 20 miles per hour, constant, across land with no trees to break it. This wind doesn't just make the cold worse through wind chill. It actively strips heat from any object through convection. A structure, a body, a fire, all bleed warmth into that moving air. The eastern woodlands, the territories around the Great Lakes and through the Northeast, face similar duration with slightly warmer temperatures, but humidity that makes the cold penetrate deeper, different terrain. Same fundamental problem. How do you stay warm when winter lasts half the year? A modern person attempting to winter in these conditions with contemporary camping gear would die. Not might die. Would die. A sleeping bag keeps you warm when you're inside it. The moment you emerge, to gather firewood, to cook, to perform any of the tasks required for survival, you're exposed. The modern approach to cold is intermittent. Create brief, intense warmth with large fires or fuel-burning heaters, then retreat into insulated gear and hope your body's heat production fills the gap. This creates a boom-bust thermal cycle. You're either too hot or too cold. The strategy exhausts the body and consumes fuel at rates that can't be sustained for months. Indigenous peoples who lived in these regions operated on completely different thermal principles. Not larger fires, not heavier clothing, not greater endurance of discomfort. Different engineering. The structures look, to modern eyes, inadequate. A teepee is a cone of hide with a hole at the top and gaps at the bottom. An earth lodge is a mound of dirt. A longhouse is tree bark wrapped around a frame. These forms don't suggest warmth. They suggest desperation. Yet historical accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries, from fur traders, military personnel, missionaries, people whose survival depended on accurate assessment of shelter, consistently express the same surprise. These dwellings were warm, not survivable. Warm. The artist George Catlin, traveling among the Mandan in the 1830s, noted that their earth lodges were more comfortable than most log houses, despite being constructed primarily of earth and grass. French Jesuits visiting Iroquois longhouses in winter complained the interiors were too hot, that they had to remove layers while inside, even as temperatures outside dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. This wasn't accident. It was thermodynamics. Sophisticated understanding of heat retention, air movement, thermal mass, fuel efficiency, and architectural design. The systems worked because they had to. Failure meant death. Success meant comfort. And the proof is this. Entire populations lived through continental winters, generation after generation, in structures that modern assumptions say should have killed them. The question isn't whether these systems worked. The question is how. Chapter 2. The teepee presents an immediate visual problem. A cone of buffalo hide stretched over wooden poles. A fire pit in the center. A hole at the top where smoke escapes. Gaps at the bottom where the hide meets earth. Cold air enters from below. Warm air exits from above. And everything about the design seems engineered to bleed heat into the winter night. Except it didn't. A properly constructed and managed tipi maintained interior temperatures 25 to 30 degrees Celsius warmer than outside air, even in sustained cold below -30 degrees Celsius. Reginald and Gladys Laubin, who lived year-round in teepees in Wyoming through the 1950s and documented their thermal performance, recorded interior temperatures of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, while outside air sat at -35 degrees Celsius. A temperature differential equivalent to modern insulated structures. Achieved with hide walls and a fire smaller than most modern campfires. The engineering began with fire placement, dead center, always, dug 6 to 12 inches below floor level. This wasn't ceremony, this was geometry. Heat radiates equally in all directions. A central fire warms a circular space with perfect efficiency. Every point on the perimeter receives equal thermal energy. Move the fire toward the wall, and you create hot zones and cold zones. Keep it centered, and the entire volume heats evenly. Fire size, 12 to 18 inches across. Sustained, constant, never allowed to grow large, never permitted to die to ash. A tipi fire consumed roughly 1/4 the wood of a frontier cabin fireplace, while heating more effectively. The principle inverts modern assumptions. We build large fires and let them burn down. Indigenous practice maintained small fires indefinitely. Large fires waste heat up the smoke hole, consume fuel rapidly, and require constant tending. Small fires, fed steadily, produce stable heat with modest fuel consumption. But a fire alone, no matter how cleverly sized or placed, cannot heat a structure with a hole at the top and gaps at the bottom. The architecture itself had to manage air. The smoke flaps, 2 adjustable extensions at the teepee's apex called ears, weren't vents. They were a functioning chimney system, each flap attached to an external pole that allowed precise positioning. On a still day, both flaps opened slightly, creating a simple exhaust. But wind changed everything. Positioned correctly, the flaps transformed moving air into a draft system. Wind passing over the opening created negative pressure through the Venturi effect, the same principle that makes air move faster over an airplane wing. This low-pressure zone actively pulled smoke upward and out. The flaps could be adjusted continuously, repositioning the effective chimney opening to face away from prevailing wind. The entire structure essentially rotated its exhaust system without moving. Cold air entered at ground level, where hide met earth. This seems catastrophic. It wasn't. The entering air fed the fire with oxygen and prevented carbon monoxide accumulation. But it entered slowly, through many small gaps rather than one large opening, and was immediately captured by the fire's updraft before spreading. The coldest air never reached the living space. It flowed inward along the ground and rose as heated gas. This system required a second architectural element, the liner. A separate wall of hide or canvas hung 12 to 18 inches inside the outer cover, extending from ground to roughly shoulder height. This dew cloth created a dead air space between inner and outer walls. Dead air, air that doesn't move, is one of nature's most effective insulators, with thermal resistance similar to fiberglass. The liner transformed a single membrane into a double wall system using the same principle as modern double-pane windows or insulated wall cavities. But the liner did more than insulate. It directed airflow. Cold air entering at ground level moved inward toward the fire along the floor, inside the liner. Meanwhile, warm air rose along the outer wall, outside the liner, radiating heat inward through the hide before eventually reaching the smoke hole. The result, a continuous convective loop. Cold in at the bottom, heat up and around, radiant warmth back inward. The architecture didn't fight air movement. It choreographed it. Occupants slept on raised platforms or thick layers of buffalo robes, 6 to 12 inches above floor level. Not for comfort, for thermal stratification. Cold air being denser, pooled at ground level. The sleeping zone occupied warmer, stratified air above this layer. Even the teepee's shape mattered. The conical form naturally channeled rising heat and smoke to a single exit point, but the cone wasn't symmetrical. The back wall stood steeper than the front, tilting the smoke hole slightly forward of the fire. This prevented downdrafts from pushing smoke back down into the living space. Wind hitting the tilted rear wall deflected upward, creating additional draw. The geometry itself generated stronger draft than a vertical cylinder would produce. These weren't separate tricks. They were integrated systems. Small, constant fire produced steady heat without overwhelming the space with smoke. Liner walls trapped air for insulation while directing cold inflow toward combustion. Smoke flaps positioned the exhaust where physics would pull hardest. Raised sleeping areas lifted bodies into the warmest air. Each element amplified the others. The tipi's genius lay in accepting what couldn't be changed: wind, cold, the need for ventilation, and turning those forces into assets. Wind became draft. Cold air inflow became oxygen supply. The smoke hole that should have bled heat instead created the pressure differential that made everything else function. This wasn't survival despite the environment. This was engineering because of it. Chapter 3. The Earth Lodge solved winter through disappearance. If air at minus 35 degrees Celsius will kill you, and wind strips heat from anything it touches, then the solution is to place yourself where winter cannot reach. Underground, wrapped in mass so great that cold takes weeks to penetrate. These were not burrows. Earth lodges built by the Mandan, Hidatsa, Pawnee, and Arikara peoples stretched 30 to 60 feet in diameter. A single structure housed 10 to 30 people, extended families spanning 3 generations. The buildings were engineered permanence, occupied year-round, rebuilt on the same foundations for centuries. Construction began by excavating 2 to 4 feet below ground level. Massive cottonwood posts, trunks a foot thick, were planted as center supports, forming a square or circular foundation. Beams as heavy as a person spanned between these posts. Radiating outward, lighter poles created the dome framework. Over this, layers of willow branches woven tight, then prairie grass thatch a foot deep, then 6 to 12 inches of packed earth and sod. The result was not a building with walls. It was a mound with a hollow center. From outside, earth lodges looked like low hills, From inside, they were caves that breathed. The thermal principle was borrowed mass. Soil 4 feet below the surface maintains constant temperature year-round, approximately 10 to 13 degrees Celsius at these latitudes. This temperature doesn't fluctuate with weather. It doesn't care about wind or air temperature. It simply exists, stable, because soil has enormous thermal inertia. It takes immense energy to change its temperature. An Earth lodge didn't fight winter. It hid inside the planet's own thermal reserve. The structure's mass created additional inertia. Those 6 to 12 inches of earth covering the dome weighed tons. That mass absorbed heat from the interior fire and held it. Modern earth-sheltered homes use this identical principle to reduce heating costs by 50 to 80%. Fire the dwelling at sunset, and the earth absorbs thermal energy. Through the night, as the fire dims or dies, that stored heat radiates slowly inward. Temperature drops, but gradually, 10 to 15 degrees over 8 hours rather than plummeting the moment the fire goes out. The fire itself sat in a central pit, larger than a teepee fire but governed by the same logic. Sustained, modest, constant. Directly above, a smoke hole pierced the dome's apex. In moderate weather, this hole stayed open, venting smoke freely. But on the coldest nights, when outside air reached minus 40 degrees Celsius and wind howled, residents could lower a cover over most of the opening. A buffalo hide stretched across a willow frame, positioned to leave only a small gap. Smoke escaped more slowly. The interior grew hazy, but heat stayed trapped, and the choice was explicit: tolerate smoke or tolerate cold. They chose smoke. The entry system functioned as an airlock. Rather than a door opening directly into the living space, earth lodges had tunnels, passages 10 to 20 feet long extending outward and downward before turning upward into the interior. This wasn't ceremony. It was physics. Cold air is denser than warm air. It sinks. A tunnel that descended before rising created a trap where the coldest air pooled in the lowest section, unable to flow upward into the living space. Wind could howl outside, but it couldn't blow directly in. It had to navigate a maze, and by the time air reached the interior, it had been slowed, mixed, and warmed by proximity to the dwelling's mass. Some designs included a pit at the tunnel's lowest point, a deliberate cold sink. The coldest air drained there and stayed there, frozen in place by its own density. Buffalo Bird Woman, a Hidatsa elder interviewed by anthropologist Gilbert Wilson in the early 1900s, described winter nights in earth lodges. Frost would form on the entrance tunnel walls, but we slept warm near the fire. That frost wasn't failure. It was evidence the system worked. Cold air was being trapped and frozen in the barrier zone rather than entering the living space. The tunnel's walls became a visible thermal boundary. Ice on one side, warmth on the other. Inside, 10 to 30 people generated heat simply by existing. A human body at rest produces roughly 100 watts of thermal energy. 30 people, 3,000 watts, equivalent to 3 space heaters running continuously. In a well-insulated earth lodge, human bodies alone could maintain survivable temperatures. The fire wasn't the primary heat source. It was supplemental, a boost to hold interior temperature at comfort rather than mere survival. The mass worked both ways. In summer, the same thick earth covering that held winter warmth inside now kept summer heat outside. Interior temperatures remained cool while the plains above baked at 35 degrees Celsius. The earth lodge didn't need seasonal modification. It was self-regulating, buffered by the planet's own thermal stability. This was architecture as thermal mass battery. Charge it with fire and bodies, insulate it with earth, and let physics hold the energy. Winters on the northern plains killed anything exposed. But underground, wrapped in soil, communities lived through 5 months of cold without struggling. They were warm because they built themselves into the only part of the world where winter's grip weakened, below the surface, where the earth remembered summer. Chapter 4. The Iroquois longhouse was not one home. It was 5, 8, sometimes 12 family compartments joined under a single barrel-vaulted roof, stretching 60 to 200 feet in length, 20 feet wide, 15 to 20 feet high at the center ridge. A structure the length of 2 modern houses, sheathed in elm bark, heated by open fires, and occupied continuously through winters where temperatures dropped below minus 20 degrees Celsius for months. The engineering problem: how do you heat a corridor that long without choking everyone in smoke or creating frozen zones at the ends? The solution was distributed heat. Fire pits spaced every 20 to 25 feet down the central aisle. 4 fires, 6 fires, sometimes 8. Each fire shared by 2 families. 1 compartment on the left side of the corridor, 1 on the right. The spacing wasn't arbitrary. Too close and smoke from multiple fires overwhelmed the ventilation system. Too far, and cold gaps opened between heat zones. 20 to 25 feet created overlapping warmth. Stand anywhere in the longhouse, and you were within effective range of at least 1 fire, often 2. Each fire had its own roof vent directly above. Removable bark panels covered these openings and could be adjusted, fully open in mild weather, partially closed during storms or extreme cold. The barrel vault ceiling shape channeled smoke upward and along the curved surface toward the vents. Rising heat from multiple fires created convective currents that pulled fresh air through the entry doors at each end. The building breathed. Cold air in low at the ends, warm air and smoke out high through the center vents. This was controlled cross-ventilation, not sealing the structure and hoping for the best. Not a single massive fire trying to heat the entire volume. Multiple small fires, each managing its own thermal and ventilation zone, together creating continuous warmth along the entire length. The bark covering provided more insulation than it appears. Elm and cedar bark sheets overlapped like roof shingles, each piece covering the joints of the layer below. Rain and snow shed outward. Smoke and moisture vapor escaped through the overlaps, but wind couldn't penetrate inward. Some longhouse construction used a double layer: inner bark, air gap, outer bark. Dead air insulation again. The same principle that made tipi liners and earth lodge mass effective. Families near the doors occupied the least desirable positions, closest to cold air intake. They compensated with heavier insulation in their sleeping areas, and additional hides hung as interior partitions. The central corridor itself became a thermal buffer. The coldest zone was the walkway, not the sleeping compartments. Raised sleeping platforms, 18 to 24 inches above the floor, lifted occupants above the ground-level cold air layer where fresh air entered and circulated toward the fires. French Jesuit missionaries in the 1600s wrote repeatedly about longhouse temperatures. They complained, not about cold, about heat. The relations, detailed reports sent back to France, describe interiors so warm that Europeans accustomed to stone buildings with massive fireplaces had to remove layers of clothing. One account notes the air was unbearably hot, despite outside temperatures well below freezing. They complained about smoke, too, but they also documented warmth that exceeded their own structures. This wasn't desperation heating. It was climate control that outperformed European technology of the same period. Fuel supply made the system possible. Hardwood forests, oak, maple, hickory, surrounded the eastern woodland territories. Hardwoods burn slowly, produce long-lasting coals, and deliver high heat output per volume. A single longhouse might stockpile 10 to 15 cords of wood for winter. Harvesting was continuous, year-round work, with massive reserves built near villages before snow arrived. The longhouse succeeded because it treated heating as distributed infrastructure rather than a central source problem. You cannot heat 200 feet of space with one fire. You can heat it with 8 fires working together, each managing a zone, each vented independently. The whole system creating overlapping warmth that left no cold gaps. The structure didn't fight winter with brute force. It divided the problem into manageable sections and solved each one. Chapter 5. The difference between survival and comfort lay in details invisible to outsiders. Fuel selection was science. On the plains, dried buffalo dung burned cleaner than wood. Lower temperature, but extraordinarily consistent. Modern testing shows herbivore dung delivers 50 to 70% of wood's heat energy by weight, but combusts more completely. Less smoke, longer coals, critical where timber didn't exist. In the woodlands, oak and hickory burned slow and hot. Ash burned green without choking smoke. Dead standing trees stayed dry. This wasn't gathering fuel. This was choosing thermal performance. Banking coals kept fire alive through 12-hour nights. Method: build a hardwood coal bed, then bury it under ash. Ash insulates, slowing combustion to nearly nothing. Morning: push aside the covering, expose embers, add tinder. No fire starting in winter darkness. The flame never truly died. Heated stones became thermal batteries. River rocks, never porous types that explode, warmed at the fire's edge, then wrapped in hide and placed inside sleeping robes. 4 to 6 hours of radiant warmth. Some groups buried heated stones beneath sleeping areas before laying down buffalo robes, a bed warmer operating on stored thermal mass. The principle threading through everything: small constant fire in insulated space defeats large intermittent fire in leaky structure. Always. Large fires exhaust fuel, create temperature swings, produce excessive smoke, waste heat through vents. Small sustained fires sip fuel, hold steady warmth, generate manageable smoke, and when combined with dead air walls or earth mass or controlled ventilation, maintain comfort indefinitely. This wasn't accident. This was empirical engineering refined across centuries. If it failed, you died. So it didn't fail.